Your sister doesn't feel special enough. That's the exact sentence my mother used to cancel my 18th birthday 4 days before it happened, over a cake she'd already ordered with my name on it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them. I just nodded, went up to my room, and started packing a bag I'd actually had ready for almost a year, because some part of me had known this day was coming long before they ever said those words out loud. They thought they were canceling a party. What they were actually doing was canceling the last reason I had to stay. My name is Hailey. For most of my life, I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need much. My younger sister, Brianna, is 2 years behind me, and from the time she was born, our house ran on one rule nobody ever said out loud. Brianna's feelings came first, and mine came whenever there was room left over, which usually wasn't often. My parents, Diane and Mark, weren't cruel people in the obvious way. They didn't yell, they didn't hit us, they showed up to school events and posted family photos on Facebook with captions about how blessed they were. But underneath all of that, there was a quiet math running in our house that only I seemed to notice. Brianna's disappointment mattered, and mine was something to be managed, smoothed over, and expected to disappear on its own. I first noticed the pattern clearly when I was 12. It was my birthday and my parents had planned a small dinner at my favorite restaurant. Brianna, who was 10, threw a fit that morning because she wanted to go somewhere else, somewhere with a play area she liked. By that evening, my dinner had quietly become family dinner at Brianna's restaurant instead, and my mother told me, smiling, that I was old enough to understand compromise. I was 12. I didn't understand compromise. I understood that my birthday had just been taken from me and handed to someone else, and everyone at the table acted like nothing unusual had happened. It happened again at 13, when my parents postponed my birthday party because Brianna had a school recital the same weekend and needed everyone's full attention leading up to it. It happened at 14 when I asked for a simple sleepover with 2 friends, and my mother agreed, only to tell me the morning of that Brianna would be joining us because she felt left out hearing us plan it. And by the end of the night, the whole sleepover had somehow reorganized itself around games Brianna wanted to play. It happened at 15, when my birthday cake somehow ended up with Brianna's name added next to mine, because she'd cried that she felt left out watching me blow out candles. By 16, I'd stopped expecting anything at all. I told my parents I didn't want a party that year, and I remember the relief on my mother's face, like I'd just solved a problem for her instead of giving up on something I actually wanted. Looking back now, I can see how gradual it all was, which is exactly why it took me so long to name it. No single year felt like a betrayal on its own. Each one felt small enough to let go of, reasonable enough to accept, especially when my mother always framed it as me being mature and Brianna being fragile. It was only when I lined all those years up next to each other, the way I eventually did sitting alone in my new apartment, that I understood I hadn't been living through a series of small compromises. I'd been living through the same decision made over and over about whose feelings counted more. But 18 felt different to me, and I let myself want it anyway, even though some cautious part of me kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. 18 meant something. It meant I was legally an adult, old enough to sign my own name on things that mattered, old enough to leave if I ever needed to. I'd been quietly saving money from my part-time job at a bookstore for almost 2 years, not because I had some dramatic plan, but because a small, steady voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to have an exit ready just in case. I kept the account under a different bank than the one my parents used for the family accounts, and I never mentioned the balance to anyone except Sophia, who was the only person who knew, from the very beginning, exactly what I was quietly building toward. I spent almost 4 months looking at listings in my spare time, walking through 3 different apartments after school before I found the studio that finally felt right, small, a little worn, but entirely mine to decide about. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Delgado, asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to sign a lease at 18 without a co-signer, and I told him, honestly, that I'd been preparing for this for 2 years, longer than most people prepare for anything. I'd found a private landlord willing to rent to an 18-year-old with a job and a clean record, half an hour away from my parents' house, close enough to still see friends, far enough to finally breathe. I signed the lease 2 weeks before my birthday, quietly telling no one but Sophia, planning to move in the weekend right after my party. For my 18th, I asked for one specific thing. A modest dinner with my grandparents, my best friend Sophia, and a few cousins I actually liked, at a small Italian restaurant we'd gone to since I was a kid. My mother agreed easily, almost too easily, and ordered a cake with my name and blue icing 3 weeks in advance. For once, I let myself get excited. I picked out a dress. I told Sophia the exact table I wanted us at. I even let myself imagine, just for a few days, that this year might finally be mine. 4 days before my birthday, Brianna found out one of her friends was having a much bigger, much cooler 16th birthday party the very same weekend. And she came home from school in tears. saying it wasn't fair that my dinner was happening the same night as something she wanted to go to instead. I remember sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when I heard her crying to my mother in the living room, the same tone she'd used 100 times before, and I remember the cold, familiar feeling that settled into my stomach before anyone had even said a word to me directly. That night, my mother came into my room, sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was little, and said the sentence that ended everything. "Sweetheart, I know this is your birthday, but Brianna's really struggling right now, and honestly, your sister doesn't feel special enough lately. Would you mind if we moved your dinner to a different night, so she can go to her friend's party without feeling guilty?" She said it so gently, so reasonably, like she was asking a small favor instead of erasing something I'd waited 2 years to have. I asked quietly if the dinner could just happen on a different day that same week, so Brianna could go to her party and I could still have mine. My mother's face tightened. "It's not really about the exact day, Hailey, it's about focus. If we do your dinner even a few days later, it'll feel like we're choosing sides, and I really don't want your sister feeling like she comes second in this family." I asked her one more question, one I'd never actually asked out loud before. "Has Brianna ever had a birthday moved for me?" My mother paused, just for a second, long enough that I already knew the answer before she said it. "That's not really the same situation," she said, which wasn't an answer at all. I sat there for a moment and something inside me finally, quietly closed. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it surprised me. I didn't feel devastated the way I had at 12. I felt calm, almost distant, like I was watching the scene happen to someone else. I nodded and said, "Okay, that's fine." My mother looked relieved, patted my hand, and told me she knew I'd understand because I always did. That was the problem, I always did. The next morning, I called the restaurant myself and quietly canceled the reservation before my mother could tell them to just move the date, because I already knew there wasn't going to be a new date, the way there never had been before. Then I called my grandmother, told her gently that the dinner wasn't happening, and asked if she could keep the news between us for a few days. She went quiet on the phone for a long moment, then said something I'll never forget. "Hailey, I've watched this happen to you since you were a little girl, and I never said anything because I thought it wasn't my place. I'm sorry for that." It was the first time anyone in my family had ever admitted out loud that they'd seen it too. Over the next 3 days, I did exactly what I'd already planned to do months earlier, just sooner than I expected. I picked up the keys to my studio apartment, which I'd quietly arranged to have ready early. I moved my clothes, my books, and the few pieces of furniture I owned out of my parents' house in 2 trips with Sophia's car, while my parents were at work and Brianna was at school. So there wouldn't be a scene, so there wouldn't be another conversation where my feelings got quietly rescheduled to make room for someone else's. I left my house key on my dresser next to a short note that said simply, "I moved out. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. Please don't show up at my apartment." I didn't leave the address. I turned 18 2 days later, alone in my new apartment, eating takeout on the floor because I hadn't bought a table yet, and it was, without question, the best birthday I'd ever had. Sophia came over with a small cake she'd bought herself, just for the 2 of us, and we sat on my bare living room floor and I blew out candles that were entirely mine for the first time in 6 years. We stayed up late that night talking, and at one point Sophia asked me if I felt guilty. I told her the truth. I didn't, not yet, and I wasn't sure if that made me strong or just numb, but either way it felt better than the alternative. The first week alone was strange in a way I hadn't expected. I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there, my mother's footsteps in the hallway, Brianna's music through the wall, and every time the apartment stayed quiet, it took me a moment to remember that the quiet was mine now, not something I'd caused a problem by wanting. My parents called that first night, over and over, first confused, then panicked, then angry. My mother left a voicemail asking how I could do this to the family right before your birthday, as if canceling my dinner 3 days earlier hadn't been the actual beginning of the story. My father's voicemail was shorter and colder, saying I was being dramatic and selfish, and that I needed to think about how this looks to the rest of the family. I didn't call back that week. I let the voicemail sit there, unanswered, while I unpacked boxes and hung curtains in my new bedroom and slowly started feeling like a person instead of a placeholder. About 10 days later, my grandmother called and asked if she could come see the apartment. I said yes, and told her the address because I trusted her in a way I didn't trust my parents right then. She showed up with grocery bags full of things she thought I might need: a kettle, dish towels, a welcome mat, small practical things that told me she'd actually been thinking about what I might be missing rather than what she wanted to say to me. She sat at my small kitchen table and told me carefully that after I left, Brianna had actually cried, not about missing her friend's party, but because she realized for the first time what it looked like from the outside. My grandmother said Brianna had asked my mother quietly, "Did we really do that to Hailey again?" and that my mother hadn't had an answer for her. My grandmother stayed for almost 3 hours that afternoon, longer than I expected, and before she left, she told me something I've held on to since. Your mother isn't a bad person, Hailey, but good people can still build bad habits when nobody ever tells them no. You were the first person in this family who ever really said it. I asked her why she'd never said anything herself, all those years she'd watched it happen. She was quiet for a moment, then said honestly that she'd told herself it wasn't her place, that parents raise their children the way they see fit, and that by the time she realized how deep the pattern had gone, she didn't know how to bring it up without it sounding like an accusation. I'm telling you now, she said, because I don't want to make that same mistake twice. 3 weeks after I moved out, my mother finally called and asked, instead of demanded, if we could talk. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near my apartment on neutral ground, with Sophia waiting in her car outside just in case I needed an excuse to leave early. My mother looked smaller somehow, sitting across from me, less certain than I'd ever seen her. She said she'd been thinking a lot since I left, and that she understood now, finally, that canceling my dinner hadn't been a small, reasonable request. It had been the last in a long line of small, reasonable requests that had quietly told me every single year that my feelings were negotiable and Brianna's weren't. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it, but I also told her that an apology didn't automatically mean I was moving back in, or that things would go back to the way they'd been before. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't argue with me about what I deserved to feel. Brianna and I talked, too, eventually, a few weeks after that. She apologized in her own way, awkward and 16, admitting she hadn't realized how many times this had happened until she saw it happen to me all at once instead of slowly, spread out across years. I didn't even think about it, she told me. It was just always how things worked. You never complained, so I guess I never really had to notice. I told her the truth, gently. None of this was really her fault. She hadn't built the pattern. She'd just been the reason it kept repeating without ever being asked if that's what she wanted either. I think that surprised her more than anything else I said. She asked me quietly if I was still going to be her sister even though I'd moved out. I told her yes, but that being her sister didn't mean I had to keep disappearing so she could feel comfortable. And she said she understood, even if I could tell she was still working out exactly what that meant. My father took longer to come around than my mother did. About a month after I moved out, he showed up unannounced at the bookstore where I worked, standing awkwardly near the front register until my shift ended. We sat outside on a bench for almost an hour while he tried to explain himself in the halting way he always talked about anything emotional. He said he'd spent most of those years assuming that if something bothered me, I would have said so, and that my silence had always read to him as agreement rather than exhaustion. I think I told myself you were just easier than your sister, he admitted, staring at his hands instead of at me, and I never asked myself what that actually meant for you. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me, and I told him so. My manager at the bookstore, a woman named Carol who'd worked there for almost 20 years, noticed the whole thing unfolding in pieces over those weeks, mostly because I kept taking phone calls in the break room with the door only half closed. She never asked for details, but one afternoon, restocking a shelf together, she said something that stuck with me. The families that raise the easy kid, she said, usually don't realize they raise someone who learned to disappear. It's not the same thing as raising someone who's happy. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. It's been 6 months now since that birthday. I still live in my studio apartment, which I've slowly filled with a real table, actual furniture, and a small shelf of books that are entirely mine. I see my parents occasionally, dinner every few weeks carefully on my terms now instead of theirs. My mother has started asking me what I want before making plans that involve me, small changes, but ones I notice every time. My father is quieter about the whole thing, still uncomfortable admitting he went along with it for years without questioning it, but he shows up now consistently in a way he never quite did before. Sophia says I seem different now, steadier somehow, like I finally stopped bracing for something to be taken away from me. I think she's right. I got a small raise at the bookstore last month, enough to start putting money aside again, this time not as an escape fund, but for something I actually want, maybe a trip, maybe just a nicer couch. It's a strange kind of freedom, saving money for something other than a way out. What I learned from that birthday that almost wasn't is something I don't think I'll ever forget. Being the easy child in a family isn't a compliment. It's often just a label for the person whose feelings everyone assumes will keep quietly rearranging themselves to make room for someone else's. My parents thought canceling one dinner would cost them very little, because I'd always absorbed it before without much fuss. They didn't realize that every single time they'd asked me to be understanding, they were spending down a kind of trust that doesn't refill on its own. Until one day there just wasn't enough left to cover one more request. I'd love to know what you think. Have you ever been the understanding one in your family, the one whose birthday, whose plans, whose feelings always seem to bend first? What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments below, and if this story felt familiar to you, stick around, because this definitely wasn't the last time my family tried to rearrange my life around someone else's feelings. Thanks so much for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next story.